The 24th of October 1944, the bridge of Yamato in the Sibuyan Sea, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stood behind the blast shields and watched smoke lie low on the horizon. Tropical light flashed off the bridge instruments. Lookouts searched through heat haze while the sea carried his whole striking force east under a sky already claimed by American aircraft. He did not turn back. After the submarine attack in Palawan Passage on the 23rd of October, after Otago went down, after Maya was lost and Taka was driven out damaged, Kurita shifted his flag, kept his battleships and heavy cruisers together, and continued the Sho-Go thrust toward Leyte. On Yamato's bridge that morning, with Musashi still afloat after the early blows, the old answer still seemed to hold. Armor could absorb. A battle line could endure contact and keep moving. Around him, the force was scarred, found, and still advancing. That was the decision, and for the moment, it looked like proof. But the sea around Kurita no longer belonged to surface ships alone. On the 24th of October 1944, in the Sibuyan Sea, U.S. carrier aviation from 3rd Fleet was already turning his approach into a battlefield, sending repeated attacks against the moving fleet before it could reach the American shipping at Leyte. By nightfall, one battleship would be gone. Musashi, one of the two Yamato-class giants, would sink in the Sibuyan Sea, and the thrust meant to break into Leyte Gulf would already be broken in practice before the next day's surface fighting began. That is the scale of the reversal. Kurita was not leading a lone raider or a damaged remnant trying to escape. He commanded the 1st Mobile Striking Force, Center Force, the main Japanese attack arm inside Sho-Go. Its purpose was direct and violent. Push through San Bernardino Strait, enter Leyte Gulf, strike the American landing forces and transports. Everything in the movement of that column pointed toward one belief that still survived inside the Imperial Japanese Navy. A powerful surface force, built around battleships and heavy cruisers, could still force its way through and smash vulnerable shipping at close range. The force itself gave that belief weight. Yamato and Musashi were the center of it, the largest battleships Japan possessed, and the heaviest symbols of what armored sea power was supposed to mean. Around them moved other battleships, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers, assembled not for defense, but for penetration. This was one of Japan's last major offensive instruments. If Kurita reached the waters off Leyte on time and in fighting order, the cost to the American lodgment could be enormous. That is why the day in the Sibuyan Sea mattered before Musashi ever rolled under. American pressure was striking the attack, while it was still in motion, still organized, still aimed forward. It did not need to wait for Kurita to reach the anchorage he intended to hit. It found him on the way, and kept finding him. The warning had already been plain. On the 23rd of October in Palawan Passage, American submarines had hit center force hard. Otago sank, Maya sank. Takao was damaged and forced out. Kurita survived, shifted his flag, and carried on. From the Japanese side, that looked like endurance. Losses had been taken. The mission had not been abandoned. The line still moved east. Then daylight over the Sibuyan Sea proved something worse. The approach itself was no longer protected by distance, armor, or the mere fact of movement. Kurita's ships could still steam, still maneuver, still fire their guns, but they could not keep the day to themselves. American aircraft returned across the same date, against the same force, before the decisive surface attack Japan wanted had even begun. That difference matters more than any single hit. A submarine ambush in a passage could wound a force and let the survivors continue. What confronted Kurita on the 24th of October was pressure that came back. It followed the column into open movement and stayed with it. Each arrival forced attention upward. Each attack threatened speed, spacing, and schedule. Every mile toward Leyte had to be fought for before the intended battle was even in sight. The Japanese side still had reasons to believe. Musashi was still afloat through the early punishment. Yamato still carried Kurita forward. The force still contained battleships, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers. Sho-Go had not been canceled. On the map, the route remained. On the bridge, the objective remained. And that made the danger easy to misread. A formation can look intact and already be losing what it came to use. The staff around Kurita could still tell themselves the same thing men in battle always tell themselves when the hull still answers the helm and the flagship still leads east. Keep moving. Hold formation. Reach the strait. Yet the answer, waiting in the sky, was counting in a different way. It was measuring not courage, not armor, not gun caliber, but time inside daylight and movement under repeated attack. On the Japanese side, the force could still believe it was advancing toward battle. The date says something harsher. By the end of the 24th of October, Musashi would be at the bottom, and the main thrust toward Leyte would no longer be proceeding on its own terms. The column still obeyed and still moved. One battleship had not yet sunk. The route ahead remained the route through San Bernardino Strait. While that future closed in, Kurita's world kept moving east. Yamato's bridge carried the weight of a fleet still under orders to break through. The sea room of the Sibuyan Sea looked wide, but inside it, every wake mattered. Battleships held their station. Heavy cruisers and escorts worked around the flagship. Smoke from earlier damage hung over parts of the formation, then thinned in the tropical glare. Men on watch kept scanning the sky because they no longer had the luxury of forgetting it. Kurita's attack force was not drifting into disaster. It was actively trying to complete its mission. That fact gives the day its force. Order still had meaning. Bearings still mattered. The force still had a destination beyond the horizon. Somewhere ahead lay San Bernardino Strait, and, beyond that, the waters where Sho-Go expected a surface blow against the American invasion to land. Every decision on Yamato's bridge was made inside that timetable, and the timetable was under attack. The pressure did not arrive as one interruption that could be endured and left behind. It kept imposing itself on movement. Kurita ordered temporary reversals of course under the strikes on the 24th of October, then resumed the advance later the same day. Those turns are the measure of what was happening. A fleet commander driving toward a narrow operational window does not reverse course in daylight unless he has been forced to pay for every minute he still hopes to keep. Each turn carried a cost that no armor belt could hide. Time bled away. Formation rhythm suffered. The eastward thrust ceased to be a clean run and became a sequence of interruptions, corrections, and renewed attempts to recover lost motion. The force could still survive hit by hit and still fail as an instrument. That was the trap closing around Kurita. He did not need to lose every ship to lose the conditions his plan required. Musashi stood at the center of that strain. Her presence inside the formation was more than tonnage. She was one of the two Yamato-class giants, a statement in steel of the belief that a battle fleet could endure punishment and still reach the decisive waters. As long as she remained afloat, the old faith could still speak. The Japanese side could look at her and tell itself the line had not been broken. Yet a fleet is not saved by symbolism when the day itself is being taken from it. That is why the scene belongs on the bridge and not only on the damaged decks below. Kurita had to command not merely damaged ships, but shrinking freedom. He was still trying to preserve an offensive movement while American pressure kept tearing at its timing. The force around him remained dangerous. Its guns had not become harmless. Its intent had not softened. But intent is not a rival. A strike arm delayed, scattered in rhythm, and forced to keep recovering its own advance, is already being handled by the enemy. The men with Kurita could still read survival as proof. They had survived submarines in Palawan Passage. They had survived into the Sibuyan Sea. They were still underway after the first attacks. To a navy raised on the authority of the surface fleet, that endurance could look like confirmation. The ships still floated. The flagship still led. The operation still had not been renounced. Yet the sea had changed around them more completely than the bridge instruments could show. The force was no longer traveling toward battle through neutral water. It was crossing a space in which an unseen American power could return within the same day and keep cutting into the movement itself. Kurita could resume his advance after a turn. He could not recover the clean certainty with which he had entered the morning. On the Japanese side, the answer was still discipline. Hold on, reform, continue east. He had already reversed course on the 24th of October and then resumed the advance later that same day. Before the sea lanes of Leyte, there had to be the making of the man who still believed he could get there. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita had not been raised for retreat. On the 20th of October 1944, with the Leyte landings underway, he held command of the 1st Mobile Striking Force, Center Force, the main surface blow assigned to Operation Sho-Go. Its purpose was narrow and brutal. Pass through the inland approaches, clear San Bernardino Strait, enter Leyte Gulf, and strike the American shipping behind the beachhead. In Japanese planning, that mission still justified concentrating battleships, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers into one advancing column. Kurita did not command a screen, he commanded the attack itself. The force carried its own argument in steel. Yamato and Musashi stood inside it, each built for the kind of sea war Japan had once expected to fight. Around them moved other battleships, a strong heavy cruiser corps, lighter escorts, and destroyers meant to keep the formation closed and moving. Even after the losses of 1944, this remained one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's last major offensive concentrations. It was feared for a simple reason. If that body of ships reached transport waters at gun range, armor and caliber would matter again, and quickly. Kurita's authority came from that surviving doctrine. The approach was not supposed to be the battle. The approach was supposed to deliver the battle line, endure contact, preserve formation, reach the decisive waters with enough heavy ships intact to smash what lay at anchor. That belief had deep roots, and in October 1944, it had not been abandoned. The route to Leyte was dangerous, but danger had always been part of the method. The point was to arrive with weight still concentrated. In that logic, losses on the way were punishment, not disproof. The 12th of October 1944. Formosa air battles. The Imperial Navy had already spent precious carrier air strength in the fighting around the Philippines, and Kurita's force would move without owning the sky above it. That absence should have been fatal to confidence. It was not. The surface force still carried the offensive burden because Japanese command still assigned decisive value to ships that could push through and fire into the invasion area. The old answer remained a surface answer. Kurita was one of the men chosen to apply it. On a chart table, the plan still looked clean. Brunei Bay to Palawan Passage. Then the inland seas. Then San Bernardino Strait. Then Leyte Gulf. A fleet staff could still draw that line with a ruler. And the men around Kurita could still believe that a column built around battleships and heavy cruisers could survive the approach long enough to make its guns count where American transports lay crowded. That was the circle around him. Staff officers, signalmen, escort commanders, engine rooms, and bridge crews all working toward one requirement: keep the force moving as a force. It was a method that had one harsh strength. It did not need elegance. It needed endurance. A damaged cruiser could fall out. A destroyer could be lost. The central mass still mattered if the central mass arrived. That is why Kurita's force could absorb warning and continue. The institution behind him had not forgotten how to measure power. It simply still measured it in hulls, armor, and the ability to break into confined water with guns ready. An officer in that command could still say the route remained open if the heavy ships kept station. He could still say the operation lived as long as the striking force lived. And on the 20th of October 1944, that belief rested on one fact. Kurita still had the main attack force. The 23rd of October 1944, Palawan Passage. The first blows came from below, and from the Japanese side, they did not yet cancel the operation. American submarines struck center force before it reached the Sibuyan Sea. Otago was sunk, Maya was sunk, Takao was damaged and forced out. Those were serious losses, especially in the heavy cruiser screen. But the larger judgment inside Kurita's surviving force went another way. The mission had been hit hard and still remained underway. Kurita survived the attack and shifted his flag. That fact mattered more to his command than any signal report. A fleet can lose ships and still keep its shape if the commander stays in control and the route remains forward. Battleships still stood in the column. Heavy units still moved. Sho-Go had not been revoked by the men afloat. In Japanese terms, the old method had just passed a brutal test. The force had taken submarine losses in a constricted passage and had not broken apart into retreat. There was even a kind of cold confirmation in the arithmetic. 3 named cruisers had been put out of action in one day, 2 sunk and 1 damaged. Yet the striking force itself still existed as an instrument. It could still steam east. It could still aim for San Bernardino Strait. It could still imagine the decisive surface attack at the end of the route. American action had drawn blood. It had not yet erased purpose. That distinction was enough to harden confidence among men trained to treat losses on the approach as the price of reaching battle. The 24th of October 1944, Sibuyan Sea. The first carrier attacks did not arrive against a defeated force. They arrived against one that had already proven to itself that it could survive contact and continue. That was the danger. Every early survival could be read as proof that the doctrine still held. The formation still had battleships. The commander still had command. The route still pointed toward Leyte. A Japanese officer watching ships remain underway could still tell himself that the essential thing had been preserved. And the sea kept answering with more aircraft. Not one interception. Not one accidental meeting. The pressure returned on the same date against the same moving force before it had reached the invasion waters it meant to attack. Kurita's side could observe the effect without understanding the full shape behind it. Reports came in. Bearings changed. Watches shifted upward. Yet as long as hulls remained afloat and engines answered, the old reading survived. Endure. Reform. Continue. That is why the first hours in the Sibuyan Sea did not immediately destroy confidence. They seemed to confirm a harder version of it. Submarines had failed to stop the force on the 23rd of October 1944. Early air attack had failed to stop it at once on the 24th of October 1944. Kurita could still measure resistance in movement, and movement still existed. One of his officers could still insist that an operation which kept advancing remained an operation alive. He could still say they had taken the enemy's first hand and kept the route. 3 cruisers were gone from the screen. The 24th of October, 1944. Sibuyan Sea. The arithmetic stopped closing. On the 23rd of October, 1944, Center Force had lost Otago and Maya, and Takao had been driven out damaged. Even after that, the main body still continued. On the 24th of October, 1944, before Kurita had reached San Bernardino Strait, American carrier aircraft were striking the same force again in daylight approach waters. Losses on one date should have bought distance on the next. Instead, the force was found again before it reached its objective. The route remained on the chart. The freedom to use it did not. Kurita could still answer in the only language a surface commander possessed. Maneuver. Preserve the column. Keep enough order to resume the advance. Yet every turn under attack spent something a battleship could not manufacture for itself. A fleet that had survived submarines in Palawan Passage now had to survive being handled in open movement from above, still short of Leyte. An officer near the flagship could still say the ships were answering the helm. He could not say the timetable was intact. 2 days, 2 attack zones, 1 force still being reached. The 24th of October, 1944. Sibuyan Sea. Kurita ordered temporary reversals of course under the attacks, and then resumed the advance later the same day. That was not collapse. It was adjustment. But the consequence can be counted. One fleet commander trying to meet one narrow operational schedule had to give up a direct run and then recover it under pressure on the same date. For a plan built on penetration and timing, a reversal was not a detail, it was a subtraction. The 25th of October, 1944. San Bernardino Strait. Kurita's surviving force passed through after the delays of the previous day. That movement carried its own consequence. The force still moved west to east through the strait, but it did so after the Sibuyan Sea had already taken time out of Sho-Go's design. The route had been held. The clock had not. A Japanese staff officer could still defend the decision in the language of obedience and momentum. He could still say the force had resumed and passed the strait. 1 passage remained. 1 day had been spent. On Kurita's side, that still looked survivable. The ships had not vanished. The mission had not yet been formally abandoned. The commander was still in place, and the formation still had enough weight to keep going. But a count had entered the operation that no gunnery table could settle. The force had survived 1 submarine attack zone and 1 day of carrier attack, and it reached the strait later than the plan required. 1 route. 1 force. 1 lost day. Late on the 24th of October, 1944, in the central reaches of the Sibuyan Sea, Kurita's formation was still trying to be a column, and no longer had the space to behave like one. American carrier strikes had already made the sea around him a sequence of evasive turns, broken intervals, and renewed attempts to dress the line. What his force lost first was choice of concentration. A battleship force built to arrive massed had to keep opening itself under attack. Musashi remained in the formation, but by then she was no longer merely a unit in line. She was damage, drag, and a center of attention the rest of the force could not ignore. As the day went on, that subtraction became physical. Musashi's speed fell. Her place in the force ceased to mean forward weight and began to mean delay imposed on everything near her. Kurita could still point surviving ships east, but he could not move the whole body at one undisturbed tempo. The American system had already been established. Its effect here was simpler. It kept coming back often enough to turn one damaged battleship into a fleet-wide timing problem. A force designed to break into Leyte Gulf with concentrated violence now had to decide how much movement it could sacrifice to keep order around a crippled giant. The next loss was defensive space. In a surface approach, sea room is a resource. It lets a commander steer, reform, and preserve intervals before the decisive waters. Kurita was spending that resource in daylight long before San Bernardino Strait. Repeated attacks forced maneuver not toward advantage, but away from immediate danger. Every emergency turn widened gaps, complicated station keeping, and made escorts answer the threat overhead before the flagship's larger purpose ahead. The line was still dangerous. It was no longer free to use the sea as approach water. It was using the sea as refuge, and refuge kept shrinking. By mid to late afternoon, the arithmetic reached the command level. Kurita had already reversed course under pressure, and then resumed. That had cost him time earlier. Now the same pattern proved something harder. Resumption no longer restored what had been lost. A force can recover heading. It cannot recover daylight already spent. It cannot give back the minutes consumed by evasive movement. It cannot make a damaged heavy ship whole by keeping station around her. The operation still possessed guns, armor, and surviving hulls. What it had less of now was reach. Orders still moved by signal. Their practical meaning narrowed with every renewed strike. Musashi's condition made that narrowing visible to everyone in the formation. A battleship of that size had been meant to absorb punishment and remain part of the offensive mass. On the 24th of October, 1944, she was absorbing punishment and being removed from that role in front of the whole force. The effect was larger than one hull. If a ship built for decisive battle could be progressively slowed, isolated, and finished before the intended surface action even began, then the cost was not only material, it was instructional. The force was learning, in real time, that mere survival after one attack did not restore freedom after the next. Then came the final subtraction before night. Kurita lost the capacity to treat damage as local. Musashi's fate was no longer Musashi's alone. Her worsening state imposed decisions on ships that still floated cleanly. Escorts had to remain. Formation attention had to divide. The column's offensive purpose had to coexist with the visible loss of one of its central symbols. That is how a plan starts to die before every ship is sunk. Not in one dramatic instant, but in administrative facts. Reduced speed, broken intervals, repeated course changes, a flagship still leading east with less force truly available to use. By late afternoon and toward evening, Kurita still had a force. He did not have an undisturbed approach. That distinction is the whole ring closing around him. American strikes had not needed to annihilate center force in the Sibuyan Sea. They had needed to keep subtracting until the force arrived later, looser, and with less usable weight than the plan required. The line still existed on the chart. In operation, it had been bent out of shape. We are under constant air attack and cannot proceed as intended. One battleship was lost on the 24th of October, 1944. The machine that made that result repeatable sat beyond the horizon on American flight decks. That answer lay not in one pilot's success or one fortunate sighting, but in the way Kurita was being reached again after each apparent survival. Third Fleet's fast carriers did not need a single perfect blow. They needed a system that could search, strike, recover, rearm, and launch again against the same moving target on the same date. That is why the figure from the previous day never closed for Kurita. Losses in Palawan Passage had not bought him a day free of decisive interference. On the 24th of October, 1944, the American force converted contact into repeatable attack cycles, and repeatability was the fact Japanese doctrine had no answer for in open movement. Kurita could see the shape of the problem and still fail to solve it. He had already shown that by reversing course under attack and then resuming the advance. Maneuver was the rational response available to a surface commander. So was dispersion within limits, so was evasive steering, so was trying to preserve enough order that the force could still reform and continue towards San Bernardino Strait. None of that was foolish. None of it could remove the cause. Every adjustment accepted the next wave as a near certainty. Each one spent time and coherence to survive the present attack, while conceding that another could arrive before the route was recovered. That was the machine behind the ring. Not simple mass. Process. Search reports fixed the force. Flight decks turned reports into launch strikes. Returned aircraft were recovered, serviced, and sent back out. Kurita was not confronting a single blow from carrier aviation. He was confronting a naval routine that could be performed repeatedly in daylight against him. Once that routine was established, his own countermeasures became local answers to an enemy operating on a larger clock. He tried the only larger answer still open to him. Continue anyway. That decision matters because it shows he did not mistake the danger for a passing inconvenience. He drove on after submarines on the 23rd of October. He resumed after reversals on the 24th of October. He was still trying to preserve offensive intention inside conditions that had already stripped away operational margin. But persistence under those conditions became a gamble with arithmetic against him. The more often the Americans could relaunch, the less value remained in merely proving that the force was still afloat. Japanese doctrine could accept losses on the approach if the main body arrived in fighting order. The Sibuyan Sea converted that doctrine into a trap. Arrival was no longer a simple matter of surviving hits. It depended on preserving timing, concentration, and command rhythm under repeated attack. Kurita could still imagine a surviving thrust. He could no longer assume that surviving ships equaled surviving capability. The distinction was brutal. A damaged, heavy force that reached the Strait late and disordered was still dangerous, but it was not the instrument Sho-Go had planned to use. That is why his adjustments failed, even when they worked tactically. An evasive turn might spoil one attack. A temporary withdrawal might reduce immediate pressure. Resumed movement might restore the heading on the chart. But every successful response operated inside a day the Americans kept reclaiming from above. Kurita was not regaining control. He was buying minutes. And minutes were exactly what his plan could least afford to lose. So desperation entered not as panic, but as the launching of an offensive movement with less and less margin behind it. By the time Musashi's loss became certain, Kurita's real shortage was not courage. It was recoverable schedule. He still had Yamato. He still had surviving battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. He no longer had the assumption that one resumed advance would stay resumed. The Americans had turned his operational future into an interval between strikes. The enemy has mastered the air, and our movements are exposed. The force had already lost one day from Sho-Go's schedule. By evening on the 24th of October, 1944, the question was no longer whether Kurita could keep moving, but what kind of force would emerge from the movement at all. Evening on the 24th of October, 1944, came down over the Sibuyan Sea, with Kurita still trying to hold command in a force that had not yet admitted defeat. Yamato remained afloat. Surviving cruisers and destroyers still answered signals. The route toward San Bernardino Strait still existed. That is what made the last approach so dangerous. The institution could still tell itself that movement meant viability, yet the formation around Kurita was now carrying the day's accumulated damage inside its structure. Musashi was no longer a symbol of endurance. She was a failing unit inside the main striking force, and everybody could see it. Her size made the fall slow enough to be witnessed and decisive enough to reorder the whole command. One of the two Yamato-class battleships was being finished in approach waters before the intended attack on Leyte shipping had begun. That fact stripped away the argument that armor alone could carry the thrust through daylight contact. Kurita remained in command. He remained under orders. But command under those conditions meant choosing among reduced options, not driving a clean offensive run. Around Musashi, the human work turned practical. Damage control continued. Escorts remained with her as her condition worsened. Other ships had to keep their own movement while the center of the force was visibly being taken out of the attack. No one on the Japanese side needed a lecture in doctrine then. The lesson was in the sea itself. A battleship built to anchor a decisive thrust was being separated from the thrust by repeated American aircraft attacks in a sea lane that had been supposed to carry her forward. Kurita's crisis was therefore institutional before it was personal. Sho-Go had demanded penetration, timing, and concentration. The American strikes had already taken time. Musashi's sinking took concentration in the most literal way. One of the heaviest units in the attack force ceased to exist as usable power before night. Earlier, Atago had been sunk on the 23rd of October 1944. Maya had been sunk the same day. Takao had been damaged and forced out. Those losses had still left Kurita able to think in terms of mission continuation. Musashi's end changed the quality of the count. A cruiser screen could be mauled, and the battleship corps still speak for the doctrine. A Yamato-class battleship going down under carrier attack spoke against it. Then the fall itself arrived. Musashi sank in the Sibuyan Sea on the 24th of October 1944 after repeated American carrier aircraft attacks across the day. Kurita survived and remained in command of center force. Musashi did not survive the evening. Atago was already gone. Maya was already gone. Takeo was out. The force that was meant to break into Leyte Gulf still existed in part, but not as planned. The direct thrust had been delayed, disordered, and cut down before it reached the waters it was meant to ravage. The American face in this moment was not a single man. It was fast carrier air groups, flight decks, strike coordination, and attacking squadrons able to return across one daylight period against the same target. That matters because it fixes the cause where Kurita experienced it. He was not being stopped by one accidental encounter. He was being worked over by a machine that could find him, launch, recover, and send aircraft back until a super battleship disappeared, and the rest of his force paid in time and order. Short numbers make the break plain. The 24th of October 1944. 1 Yamato-class battleship sunk. 1 of 2 gone. 3 named cruisers had already been put out of action on the 23rd of October 1944. 1 day lost from Sho-Go schedule. 1 main attack force still moving, but no longer proceeding on its own terms. Kurita could still lead surviving ships onward after dark. He could not lead Musashi onward. And he could not restore the confidence with which center force had entered the Sibuyan Sea that morning. The operation had not ended in a formal signal. It had been reduced in the water, in daylight, in front of the commander who had to keep going with less. We were defeated by air power. 1 super battleship had been sunk before the attack reached Leyte. Ahead lay the passage through San Bernardino Strait, with a force already cut down by the day. And when the count closes, it closes hard. Kurita's force reached action off Samar on the 25th of October 1944, but it did not destroy the American invasion shipping in Leyte Gulf that Sho-Go had been built to hit.